This meeting is being recorded.
Great. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We know that there is so much going on this week and really appreciate you taking the time for just another crisis that is facing our communities and that we're ready to respond and react on. So welcome to this webinar, Public Charge, What Does It Mean for the HIV Community? This webinar is being sponsored by African Services Committee in collaboration with HIV Power Shift, HIV Abiertas, Positive Women's Network USA, and the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus. And we have some really fantastic presenters on here for you today. I'm Nana Khanna, Executive Director of Positive Women's Network USA. We are a national membership body of women and folks of trans experience living with HIV based out of Oakland, California. Although I'm in DC today because there's a lot going on in DC today. So I'm very honored that we are being joined by a bunch of amazing presenters. And let me just walk you through a quick agenda, what we're going to do today. So welcome and introductions. I'm just going to introduce our presenters. And then we're going to hear from Priscilla Huang from the National Health and Law Program, NHELP, more commonly known as NHELP, on sort of like what is public charge, the history and current policy. And then Amanda Lugg and Jackie Vimo are actually sort of going to go back and forth, I think, with their presentations. So we have a segment that's sort of like starting us off on what does public charge mean for the HIV community. And then we're going to talk about what we can do to fight the proposed public charge rule from the administration. There's a lot of incredible organizing that's been happening already, led by the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition and, in partnership with lots of immigration rights and other human rights and civil rights groups around the country. And so we're going to hear about, specific and concrete ways folks can plug in. And so let me just briefly introduce you to our presenters. Priscilla Huang is a senior attorney in the LA office of NHELP. Priscilla focuses on reproductive health and justice issues in Medicaid and the private insurance market. And she brings a background in reproductive justice, racial and ethnic health disparities, and immigrant healthcare access. And previously, prior to joining NHELP, Priscilla was a consultant and senior advisor with the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We also are joined today by the incredible Amanda Lugg, who probably many of you know, Director of Advocacy at African Services Committee, an incredible organization in New York City that provides health, housing, legal, and social support services to over 10,000 immigrants each year. And Amanda has worked, for a long time at the intersection of healthcare and immigration, advocating for sound and effective public policy to ensure affordable quality healthcare for immigrant and asylum-seeking populations, and particularly with a focus on HIV and folks who are living with chronic illnesses. And Jackie Vimo is our third presenter today. Jackie is a policy analyst who oversees the Economic Justice Program at the National Immigration Law Center. And NILC is a national organization that does policy analysis, litigation, education, and advocacy to defend and advance the rights and opportunities of low-income immigrants and their families. Jackie's been involved for nearly 2 decades on a broad range of issues, ranging from HIV to public health, worker rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, anti-poverty policy, lots of issues that touch our community. And so we really have a stellar cast of presenters lined up for you today. So just some little housekeeping before we move into our presentations. We are going to have time for questions at the end. I think what we'll do is folks can also chat in on the chat box your questions. I'm going to try to track them as best I can over the course of the webinar. We can, and you can also raise your hand if you have a question you want to ask verbally, and you can be unmuted to ask your question. There are a lot of people on the line, so we're not going to unmute all the lines at once. We have, I think, close to 100 folks on, which is about our capacity, and that's wonderful. And we are also recording this because there were a lot of people who wanted to be on today, but weren't able to make it. So we will be circulating this and posting the link up online as well. And so, you know, just a little bit of framing. This issue is deeply important to Positive Women's Network and many of the U.S. people living with HIV networks that we work with, because we know that immigrants living with HIV are some of the most vulnerable folks in our communities. And there are many immigrant families that rely on multiple forms of public benefits in order to survive. And I think a lot of us are very familiar with the statistics for people living with HIV. So over 40% of people living with HIV are Medicaid. Among PWN's membership, based on surveys we've done, we found that about 42% of our members are on SNAP, which is food stamps. These are programs that are currently being targeted by the administration under the proposed public charge rule. So this could have a very devastating impact on people living with HIV. I do want to point out that there are some programs we may not talk about explicitly on this webinar, and there is a reason for that. And so if you have questions about particular programs, we encourage you to chat those into the chat box rather than asking them verbally, so that we don't have to be concerned about circulating this recording, because the purpose of that is that if some programs are not vulnerable right now, we don't want to make them more vulnerable by drawing attention to them. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. I do see a question about whether the slides will be available. Yes, the slides will be available. The recording will be available. And this is part of why we want to be kind of careful about what gets said and what doesn't get said on today's webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn this first section over to Priscilla Huang to talk to us a little bit about public charge, the history of public charge, and what current policy is.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you to the Positive Women's Network and to all of the other organizers and co-sponsors. I'm going to give a little background on the public charge history. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what do we mean by public charge? In general, public charge refers to a person who is likely to become primarily dependent on the government for financial and material support. And so a person who's found likely to become a public charge may be denied either admission to the United States or denied legal permanent residency status or green card. In very rare circumstances, public charge can be used as a basis for deportation. That's part of the Immigration and Nationality Act. There's a section in there that does allow for that ground, but again, I just want to underscore that's a very rare occurrence. Next slide. I did want to, I spend a little bit on the history of public charge just because it's important to understand the framing for why public charge is such a discriminatory policy. I really appreciated just the framing of this webinar with public charge as structural violence, because I definitely agree that this policy, given its origins and given the intended impacts that the changes will have, certainly fall into that category. So, you know, the theory behind public charge actually even predates federal immigration law. In the early 1800s, the slave states such as Alabama would only authorize grants of emancipation to individual slaves on the condition that they never become a public charge. We see this policy formalized and codified in the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1882, which, by the way, was the same year that Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the public charge was used as a way for immigration officials to keep out a whole list of immigrants that were considered undesirable at the time. So it started with Irish Catholics, Chinese and other Asian immigrants, Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. There's a long list of categories that this impacted, including people with HIV. Next slide, please. So there's sometimes confusion about who's subject to public charge. I think especially because there was some media coverage earlier in the summer that made some mistakes in terms of who is actually subject to a public charge determination. So a public charge assessment is made when an individual, again, either applies to enter the U.S. from abroad, so from an embassy or consular office, and public charge is also applied when somebody who's already in the U.S. applies to adjust their status to become a lawful permanent resident. There is no public charge test for someone applying to become a U.S. citizen, and deportation based on public charge is extremely rare. I think it's also important to note that there are a number of humanitarian immigrant categories that are exempt. So that includes refugees, asylees, survivors of trafficking, domestic violence, and other serious crimes. So these individuals are not subject to a public charge assessment. Next slide, please. What benefits are considered? So under current policy, there are basically only two types of benefits that are considered. Those categories are either cash assistance for income maintenance, so that it refers to TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, which is also known as welfare. Some states and local governments have a general assistance fund, or SSI, supplemental security income. The other category is institutionalization for long-term care at government expense, other than imprisonment. So some examples there are like Medicaid funded long-term care in a nursing home, for example, or a mental health institution. And these have been the only categories where a public charge have been, where receipt of these benefits have been considered in a public charge assessment. And they are have been in effect since about 1999, when the last set of proposed rules came out after there was a lot of confusion due to welfare reform of 1996 and other laws that changed and imposed more restrictive immigrant eligibility categories on immigrants. Next slide, please. So the other important consideration to know about what's currently in effect is how a public charge determination is made. So currently, an immigration official uses what's called a totality of the circumstances test. And what that means is there are a number of factors listed here: age, health, family status, financial status, education, and skills. And also, immigration official can consider an affidavit of support. And not any one of these outweighs the other. You're supposed to look at all of an immigrant applicant's these factors all at once. And it's also the public charge test is prospective, or intended to be forward-looking. So you can't look at any benefits that the immigrant applicant might have received in the past. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to, I think, Amanda to start talking us through some of the proposed changes.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to switch the slide deck. Okay, great. Amanda, are you seeing your slides? We're not hearing you. Might need to unmute.
Actually,
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great.
But actually, you're really faint.
Okay.
That's better.
That better?
That's better.
Okay, great. All right. So first, hi everyone. Thank you so much. It's so great to hear that so many people are on this webinar, given the importance of it to our community and the importance to get the correct information, because there's a lot of rumors flying around out there. And also big thanks to Mitch McConnell's BFF for putting this together. It's very much appreciated, but Positive Women's Network and Nana particularly, and for Priscilla and Jackie to help us get this information out there to everyone. So I just wanted to just speak very quickly as an organization serving folks who are directly impacted by this proposed public charge. Next slide, please. And very quickly, why we're concerned about this. African Services, we serve primarily the African immigrant community here in New York City. And the large majority of our folks come from highly impacted HIV, countries highly impacted by HIV, my apologies. And we provide health, housing, AIDS housing. We have a large legal immigration department, which is getting busier and busier by the day, as you can imagine. We have ESL classes. Majority of our folks are Francophone Africans. So we have French as the common language in the office, but over 70%, I believe it is, of our staff are African born. So we have over actually 25 languages covered. And we also have 3 HIV and community development clinics in Ethiopia. So that's why we are very gravely concerned about what's going on. Next slide, please. Or not, perhaps the next one. So that was a that was a wrong slide. But what I was going to say with that previous slide was that you may have seen back in May, when the first draft of this public charge proposal was leaked by the Washington Post, in which Jackie's going to talk about more very soon. But it was at that point that the rumor mill began within our communities, and we began to see folks coming in with grave concerns and questions about their benefits, and quite chillingly, we understood the totality of the really catastrophic public health implications that this proposal could have. We were having, and still do to some extent, we were having members of the community come in and speaking to their case managers as to whether they should perhaps stop taking their HIV meds, because they needed to be able to be eligible to apply for a green card because their children were waiting for them to be brought over. We had other people who were refusing any housing assistance because they heard that you couldn't accept housing and still be able to apply for a green card. We had people who were asylees who had already been for their interview, who, because they were HIV positive, then believed that because they were positive, they'd have things turned around. So just a lot of misinformation, and that's what we've been dealing with over the last few months. Trying to do as much one-on-one with folks, because of course everyone's cases are individual and unique, which underscore the reason for us we're always saying that you must, before you do anything or think of doing anything, to speak to a licensed attorney, preferably an immigration attorney, not your barber, not your your hairdresser, not your neighbor. You need to speak to an immigration attorney. So that said, we've just been advising folks to do absolutely nothing yet, as legally nothing has changed. And what we did was got straight on board with the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, which Jackie at the National Immigration Law Center, they co-chair. So this, which we can put up again, this slide here is the website for the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, which is really the authority on organizing nationwide on public charges, Nana said. Right now, what we can do, of course, is the Protect Families hashtag, which is trending on social media. Start talking about it, and please sign on to their statement opposing this public charge, which is available on the website. So we can go back to that, but now I think I'll just kick it over to Jackie and we can get down into the dirty details.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Amanda, although I'm really not sure how I feel about being referred to as Ms. McConnell's BFF. I love you anyway.
He's still driving around in a daze.
Okay, cool. So thank you for setting us up so well, for understanding exactly where we are. And now Jackie is going to help us understand exactly what is on the table. There have been multiple versions of this proposed rule leaked in draft form. The latest version of it came out, really kind of offensively on a Saturday in the middle of a busy time for everybody anyway. And so Jackie's going to help us understand what's really on the table here.
Great, thank you so much. Can folks hear me? Yep. Good, great. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the proposal, the proposed changes to the public charge policies. I'm going to talk about who this impacts, and I'm going to talk about what kind of messaging we hope folks will use both for policymakers and for directly affected individuals and families. Next slide, please. So what is the new threat? Next slide, please. I think that it's important to note, I thought that Priscilla's point about, the history of public charge is so important, understanding that it has, a history around excluding folks based on race, based on, a number of different factors, turning away Jews fleeing the Holocaust, and that there also have been a lot of rumors, and that when it first started, public charge again was, it was used around slaves. It was also used to stop the Irish who were fleeing the potato famine and living in almshouses from entering the colonies. And that was actually where the sort of impetus behind it came in terms of its current codification in law. Keep the Irish Catholics out, which were considered the foreign race at that time. So it's important, as was mentioned, that there have been multiple leaks of this. The first leak came out in January 2017 through a set of 4 executive orders that were leaked to Vox and the Washington Post. The other 3 were the Muslim ban, the rescission of DACA, and the Interior Enforcement Memo that eliminated enforcement priorities so that everyone is a target for immigration enforcement. So as you might know, the other 3 are already in effect or have been promulgated in some way, and so we've been waiting for this. And in that time period, again, there were leaks, in February and March. There's been a lot of opportunity for folks to spread a lot of misinformation. That said, some things have changed. The one thing that actually has changed officially, is the only thing that's changed officially, is changes that have been made to the Foreign Affairs Manual, or the FAM. The FAM, for those of you who are not immigration attorneys, is basically the Bible that consular officials overseas use to kind of decide who gets in and who gets out. One of the things that happened back in January is they made changes to the FAM where they shift the focus in the public charge test. Now, in the past, if you had an affidavit of support from an individual who was very financially stable, financially well off, that was enough. That, if I, married Mark Zuckerberg, or Mark Zuckerberg wanted to petition for me, for better or worse, that would be, and he had signed an affidavit of support for me, that would have been sufficient to overcome any public charge concerns. What happened in the FAM back in January is they shifted the application from the sponsor who signed the affidavit of support to the applicant, him or herself. And so that suddenly meant that if you didn't already have a job in the United States, if you didn't already have health insurance in the United States that was unsubsidized, that could be used against you in a public charge determination. Important to note that public charge still only looks at cash and long-term care. So cash and care are still the only 2 things that are under current public charge rule, but that's a big game changer because, really hard to get a job if you're not already in the country. Next slide, please. So the text, so as was mentioned, all of us had a fantastic Saturday night on September 22nd at 6:30 Eastern time, which was that DHS, 1, leaked it to the press, and there was just a barrage of press articles, and 2, they posted it on their website. It's important to note that just because they posted it on the DHS website, that is actually not an official document. They still could change it. They have to do a notice of proposed rulemaking, and that has to be officially posted as an NPRM, as they called it. And so that has not happened yet. So what the proposal does, which we've been waiting for a long time, is it broadens what the concept of public charge to also cover other issues beyond just cash and long-term care. It covers work and also public health benefits, public health. It counts food, health, and housing programs. And it makes it easier to penalize families under the totality of circumstances test that Priscilla was explaining. Next slide, please. Again, the initial definition of public charge, the current definition, is that a public charge is someone who is primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. The proposed definition, what Stephen Miller and Trump and all these folks want to do, is change it to be public charge means an alien or an immigrant who receives one or more public benefits, and that is really, you know, a huge game changer, you know, in terms of those who are, you know, those of us who have been doing the work. Now, I've been doing this work for over 2 decades, and I've always been able to go to immigrant communities, to family members, to friends, and say, you can safely access health programs, nutrition programs, housing programs without worrying that will impact your immigration status. As long as you don't get cash, as long as you're not getting TANF or SSI, as long as you're not getting having long-term institutionalization, you are A-okay. Well, the Trump administration wants to change that. Next slide. So what the proposal does is it adds programs that can be counted as part of the public charge determination to include food stamps or SNAP, Medicaid, that's non-emergency Medicaid. So actually they specifically excluded emergency Medicaid, which is primarily for undocumented folks, Medicare Part D, low-income subsidies, and housing assistance. So Section 8 vouchers, project-based subsidies, and public housing. So now suddenly it's not just cash and long-term care, it's food, it's healthcare, it's housing. And cash and long-term care are still as part of the list. Next slide, please. You know, so it's important to note that in the statute, there still are folks who are exempt from, as was mentioned earlier, Priscilla, that doesn't change. The green card holders sort of who are applying to naturalize, to get their citizenship, this doesn't count for them. Refugees, asylees, all that are not counted. So just important to note that there are some people to whom this still doesn't apply. Next slide, please. So basically, it also adds this new criteria for this totality of circumstances test. And you know what totality of circumstances is again, this, as was described earlier, is, you know, this officer has to make this tremendously discretionary decision about, not about what your past is or even what your present is, but whether you are likely in the future to become a public charge. It's like they have a crystal ball and they're going to guess where you're going to be in 10 years. I mean, who's going to know, right, about that? You know, I wish I knew where I was going to be in 10 years. And how they're making that determination is, again, whether or not people have used any of these benefits, not just cash and care, but also a number of other things, including your health conditions and whether or not you have insurance. So if you are living with HIV or AIDS, that can be taken into consideration, and to whether or not you're likely to become a public charge. They can take into consideration your age. An infant who is not working, will that infant be a public charge? Or a senior person, you know, a person who's over a certain age may be considered likely to be a public charge because they're older. Again, your employment status, whether you're employed or not. And then this new threshold, which is if your income is under 125% of the federal poverty line. And that like automatically kind of gets put into the negative factor. Also, your education and English language proficiency, which means, you know, if you happen to come from a country where they don't speak English, which probably isn't surprising, is a lot of those countries are not Scandinavian countries, like Trump has described, then you could be considered a public charge or likely to become a public charge, which is, ridiculous because many people learn English over the course of the time that they're here. And so to have that be the test before you can even come into the country, obviously discriminates against broad swaths of people, including, like Amanda said, large parts of Francophone African countries, that are the sources of how we get a lot of non-white immigrants into this country. They can look at your credit score, and they can look at whether or not you've gotten a fee waiver for immigration benefits. So it's not an exhaustive list, but that's kind of like all the things that go onto this scale. Next slide, please. So again, in the past, as I said, having an affidavit of support from someone who signed a contract promising to be responsible for you is not sufficient to overcome public charge. Now it's just a heavily weighted, it's not heavily weighted, it's just sort of one of the factors. And again, they're gonna make a decision about how to count your affidavit of support based on a number of other, set of criteria. So next slide, please, we can just keep on going, it's a complicated thing. Other things, let's see, next slide would be, the other important thing to note is that this has not taken effect, right? And they're not going to count your current receipt of benefits unless you use them after the rule is finalized and after a delay of an implementation period that they're going to have. So it's going to be at least, once the rule hits the notice of proposed rulemaking stage, once it's published, we'll have 60 days to comment, we think. And then after that, they have to read all of our comments. And then after that, there's still going to be we're imagining like another 60 days before there's an effective date. So folks, who are worried about the use of public benefits now, any of those benefits that are not counted under the current laws are not going to be counted in the future. Next slide, please. So there's really only one heavily weighted positive factor, which is that the non-citizen is currently employed with an annual income of at least 250% of the federal poverty line for the household size, as indicated in the recent year. So to be clear what that means, so they're saying you need to have at least 250% FPL in order to not be subject to this test. This is, for a family of four, nearly $63,000 a year, right? The median income for households in the US was $61,400 in 2017. So they're saying that you need to earn more than the median income to not be considered a public charge. And again, this is completely arbitrary. There's no basis in law for this. Next slide, please. Again, as I mentioned, people are very concerned about that they're using benefits now. This is not a retroactive test, so people don't need to worry about the benefits that people are using now. It's a very important message. Next slide, please. So who is this going to impact? Next slide. So just to be really clear, if right now, if US-born US citizens had to take the public charge test, under the current rule, about 4 or 5% of people wouldn't be able to pass it. Under the proposed rule, 1 in 3 US-born citizens would struggle to meet the standard for the public charge test. That's 1/3 of Americans would be considered public charges. If they looked back into people's history a few years back, 1 in 2 Americans would not be able to pass the public charge test. This is an extreme test, and this is not just even going after, the lowest wage, lowest income immigrants. This is about, even attacking middle-class immigration. And, again, this is fundamentally not what public charge meant when the concept was created. We have many families that are, people working 1 job, 2 jobs, and they're still getting benefits to make it through hard times. So to penalize someone for that, again, that is not about being primarily dependent on the government. That is, in our economy right now, many people need benefits in order to make ends meet. That doesn't mean that they're primarily dependent. So this is a really big shift. Next slide, please. So one of the big things that's happened is in the earlier drafts of this, they were going to count benefits used by US citizens and other members of the household as part of the test. There was a lot of outcry over that. And And so a lot of people are saying, well, oh, this is great. This is so much better than earlier rules. Well, first of all, the idea that, and we have Francis Cisna, the director of USCIS, telling us, oh, this is ridiculous. This isn't going to hurt kids. This is just, going to impact the immigrants themselves. Well, there's no way that you can hurt an immigrant without hurting their household or their family member. You're going to hurt an immigrant parent. You're going to hurt an immigrant kid. Of course, kids shouldn't be the only thing that we're worried about, but this has become one of the framing issues. Also, if the kid, him or herself, is an immigrant, they are also going to have to pass the public charge test. And just in general, sort of really resisting this narrative. This is a radical departure from existing policy, and that's what we should focus on, not whether or not earlier drafts were worse, because this is exactly what this administration does, is it moves the goalpost further and further into such extreme, proposals, like, having kids maybe be deported for using a public benefit who are US citizens, right? Like, oh, put that crazy idea out there. And then suddenly a public charge test that looks at Medicaid and food stamps seems a lot more reasonable, right? And so I think it's really important that we don't focus on leaks. We don't focus on earlier drafts. We say the current policy is it's only cash and care, and any expansion of that is outrageous and a radical shift in policy. Next slide, please. Again, to mention, how many people this is going to impact, we estimate that about 26 million people in families with immigrants, non-citizens specifically, are going to be maybe chilled from using these programs. 1 in 4 kids in this country have an immigrant parent. So that's like potentially a quarter of all kids in this family, in this country, being impacted. And this is something we're going to pay for years to come. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm going on too long. So I think that the most important piece, this is a very complicated thing, how the public charge test is going to play out is, no one really knows. This is still a proposal. But ultimately, this is an affront to our, to communities of color. The majority of the people that are going to be impacted are going to be community of color. This is an affront to our current immigration system. That's a family-based immigration system. And ultimately, we know from back in '96, the last time that they had a major change to our welfare system, that millions of immigrants actually went off of benefits, even though they actually weren't impacted by this because of this chilling factor, because people are scared. And we're already seeing that since January 2017. I mean, I'm getting calls of people going off their cancer meds, even though they're a US citizen, because they have a green card holder husband. Well, I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, one thing that I have to mention over and over again is dead people don't win immigration cases. And that is really the situation that people are being put in, choosing their own lives or the lives of their family members over their ability to stay together. And staying together in this country, might be, in some cases, some people are making decisions where that's more important to them than their own lives, right? And which is just an unacceptable position to have to put families in. So I think that the important thing is just, this is a proposal to target families who are just trying to access programs that make them healthier and stronger, and we have to fight back. Next slide, please. And then Amanda's going to tell you how to do that. In terms of our public messaging, it doesn't matter. You don't have to know the specifics of this. This is ultimately just, you don't have to be an immigration lawyer. And what this proposal does is try and make families have to become immigration lawyers to figure out, even immigration lawyers don't understand this right now, right? To figure out how this is going to impact their families. So at the end of the day, it's just, this is a proposal to radically redo our immigration system to one where it's only the wealthy need apply, only Norwegians need apply, and rewrite that Statue of Liberty. Bring us your tired, your poor, to bring me your rich, your PhDs with STEM degrees, not stem cell, and your Norwegians, right? And English speaking only, right? That's a real change, and people need to speak out against that. Next slide, please. Again, to fight the chilling effect, and we can sort of go on about this later, but in questions, but just, we're already hearing that people are being chilled. Many people are not subject to it. The law hasn't changed yet. The policy hasn't changed yet, and nothing that people use now is going to be counted against them. Next slide, please. So educating folks, if you're working with communities that are experiencing this, is really important. Tell them that nothing has changed. Tell them that even if it does change, there's still going to be a totality of circumstances test. So it's not like you used a health benefit once and automatically, you're a public charge. And we don't see any benefits to individuals who are currently receiving public assistance to getting off of those right now. It doesn't make any sense. If you're already on them, then it already would count against you if it did, but it's not going to count against you anyway. So please do share that message with folks and urge them to not get off of benefits, but also to join us in fighting back. And with that, I'll turn it to Amanda to talk about how to do that.
Great, thank you. Let me switch the slides back.
All right, thank you. So yeah, that's okay. Right. So this one, I just very cognizant of who I was going to be speaking to today. I thought it appropriate to just put a couple of slides in of what we did in New York and what you can do right now, get out on the streets. We had an excellent rally outside the Tenement Museum in Lower East Side, New York City, of course, well known for where immigrants first came off Ellis Island back in the day. And we shut down Delancey Street. We had a CD, 14 arrests. It was fabulous, a lot of press. And we had a number of state senators and council people speak up against this ruling proposal. Next slide, please. More of this. And next slide. Okay, so you keep hearing we can fight back, we can fight back. This proposal, Congress has absolutely nothing to do with this proposed ruling. The only opportunity for any change to happen on this ruling will come from us, will come from the public. And that is, as what Jackie mentioned, there's public comment time, which will be a 60-day window for us to be able to write in to the government explaining why we think this is horrific, immoral, and wrong thing to do. So right now, as we heard, nothing's changed here if you're in the country. The proposed rule, when it is published to the Federal Register, which we are expecting any day now. We were told on Monday that it was going to happen this week, but we've been told lots of things many times before. The proposed rule will go on www.regulations.gov. You will hear about it from us. If you go join the Protecting Immigrants campaign, you'll get an alert as soon as that happens. And that's when we have 60 days, hopefully 60 days is what they've suggested that we'll have. Legally, we only need 30, but we should have 60 days to send in, to flood Homeland Security and the rest of them with our public comments. Now, what the Department of Homeland Security has to read every single comment and consider all the arguments. The Protecting Immigrants campaign will be able to provide, once this rule is published, they'll be able to with public comment on issue-specific arguments. So for this, like for us, for the HIV community, we actually, our legal department, African Services, put together a template where you could use legal arguments saying why this is wrong, why this is unfair. But also you can just write, you could just write your outrage as well, how this is just wrong. It, like Jackie's saying, it just completely changes the goalposts. And I'll expand upon that more in a second. I want to get through this because I know we're going to have questions. But once they've read all the comments, then the final rule will be published in the register. And then they have to wait another 60 days before it actually goes into effect. So at a minimum, we're looking at February before anything would happen. So like everyone's saying, please, there's absolutely no reason to cancel any benefit that you or your client may be on right now. Absolutely no reason at all. The piece that Jackie mentioned about the FAM, the Foreign Affairs Manual, at African Services, we are advising folks if they're planning on leaving the country for a holiday or a short stay to speak to an attorney, an immigration attorney before they do, because what might happen is they might not be able to get back in. So please, if you're going to leave the country and intend on coming back, speak with an immigration attorney before that happens. Okay, next and final slide, I believe. All right, in our true activist fashion, act up, right back. Pretty good, right? Okay, act up, right back. So PIF wants to flood at least 100,000 public comments. Who can comment? Anyone, absolutely anyone. You, your mother, your brother, your neighbor, anybody can send in a public comment. It's going to go in on an online portal. And again, the Protecting Immigrants, Immigrant Families campaign will, and Priscilla mentioned it too, will have a microsite, which will be ouramericanstory.us, that you can enter your public comments through, so that we can keep a copy of those comments. So we have evidence, we have duplication of those comments. And should this, or rather when this goes to litigation in the future, then those people bringing those actions will have evidence of stories, particularly if certain arguments were not addressed. And what you can say, I mentioned that we had the templates. When to comment, still not yet. Don't bother going to that ouramericanstory.us because it's not live yet. But join the campaign when it's all go. You will be alerted to that. So I want to hand it back because I'm understanding that we have questions.
Great. Thank you so much, all of the presenters. That was really powerful. And I think I just want to underscore the importance of the volume of comments we saw, and of using the microsite so that the comments can be tracked. I think what we saw in a situation like net neutrality was a lot of contention about where it wasn't clear that the administration was being totally transparent about the number of comments they had received for and against proposed changes. And so it is important that we keep our own record so that can be provided to attorneys. So I see that
Can I just add one important thing, which is, so templates are great, but one of the things that we've learned from the net neutrality campaign, from the citizenship question on the census public comment campaign, is if you just copy and paste a template, it's only counted as one, even if 100,000 people copy and paste and it's 100,000 different people, the same words or very similar words, they actually count that as one. So people need to have like original comments. They have a machine that reads them. So if, like, let's say there's 50,000 groups that work on HIV/AIDS issues and they copy and paste the same comment, that again would only count as one. So if people, you don't have to be an expert on these issues, but personalize it in whatever way you can. If you're seeing it in your community, if you want to, you don't have to be directly impacted. You can talk about sort of ripple effects, but having the comments be unique is really important.
Great, thank you so much. So we do have some questions coming in on the chat box. There's a question that says, how does this apply to cities with sanctuary city policies, such as San Francisco? Anybody want to take that?
Priscilla, do you want to take that?
I can. Sure. I can. Feel free to jump in, Amanda and Jackie. So sanctuary city policies and sanctuary state policies are generally referred to policies that would minimize interaction between law enforcement and immigration enforcement officials. So it's a different issue than what we're dealing with in the public charge context.
Yeah, and what we've seen in part is that even though these cities are sanctuary cities, I live in Oakland, there's no way to protect people against these types of policies, no matter where they are. And even even immigration related policies, like we had somebody who was detained, a human rights activist from the Philippines, detained for 28 hours in the San Francisco airport even though San Francisco is a sanctuary jurisdiction, and he was interrogated by ICE for 28 hours.
One more, can I just add one more piece to that? I don't let you finish, but
go ahead.
Just that this actually disproportionately targets cities that have high levels of immigrants, because when people stop getting off of Medicaid, for example, those bring in federal funds. So then that's going to mean that who is going to have to pay for that is going to be the state or the locality that's going to have to dip into their charity care funds and their uncompensated care pools in order to pay for people that should rightfully have every right to, are eligible for Medicaid and should be able to draw down federal dollars. So this is going to hit the hardest places like Oakland and New York City and so forth that have high levels of immigrant populations.
So there's another question. Can you please re-clarify how or if the public charge modifications will impact American-born citizens and American naturalized citizens? Jackie, do you want to take that?
Sure. So right now, under the current draft, there isn't any language in there about this applying to naturalization. So it should not apply to those folks. Again, the test only happens when you're applying to enter the United States or when you're applying to adjust your immigration status, such as applying for a green card. The Department of Justice is going to be putting out, this only applies again to adjustment of status and does not apply to deportation or removal. We are waiting for another set of regulations that is going to pertain to deportation that's going to be coming out very soon. And the way that we really see that kind of playing out, I mean, really, we still don't really have any idea how they're going to apply it. But the very likely way that might kind of very narrowly be applied is like looking back to question whether or not there was any fraud in the initial application. So they might like dig into people's backgrounds to look at the original application. But again, we don't really know. We're waiting to hear. In terms of current green card holders, there should be no impact on them after the first 5 years. But the first 5 years is a challenging kind of period. It's important to note that during those first 5 years, most green card holders are not eligible for Medicaid or federal benefits to begin with. So that does significantly narrow it down. I think when you talk about what the impact on folks is more broadly, it's going to be chilling effect. It's going to be people getting off the benefits because better safe than sorry. And that's really going to be the primary impact.
So one of the questions there are a bunch of questions actually in the chat box, and I'm going to try to get through all of them. But I think one of the big questions is looking at this like totality of circumstances test and having health conditions, especially like expensive health conditions, being one of those criteria there, both for entry, both through the FAM, like at the consulates, and also for adjustment of status. Can you talk a little more specifically about impact on immigrants living with HIV? Both for entry and for adjustment of status. What are we looking at here? How might HIV be considered? I did kind of skim the whole rule on that Saturday night. It's 447 pages, and kind of what I was able to ascertain is that right now there are a list of there's a specific list of like Class A and Class B sort of health conditions that are used at consulates currently. Currently, HIV is not explicitly on that list, but it was in the past on that list. And so I don't know that we can be convinced it isn't going to come back, or couldn't come back sort of like de facto as another consideration. And then secondly, there's a list of the 5 or 6 kind of most expensive health conditions referenced a couple of times in the rule, just in the context of like how they're looking at health as a negative determining factor. And a number of things are listed there. HIV is not specifically listed there. Cancer, pulmonary disease, I think some other things are listed there. So can the panelists share anything with us specifically about what we should be thinking about as an HIV community?
I mean, I do think that, and Amanda actually said it best in her post. I mean, this is a de facto HIV travel ban. You know, we're back to kind of the pre-Obama era of, you know, because even if it's not explicitly listed, you have people, you know, if implemented. I mean, again, we'll fight it, and we'll see what happens, you know, if it is finalized. But if they're going to take into consideration whether or not you're going to likely be a public charge, and they're going to want to know whether or not you have health insurance to cover your conditions, then if you're a person living with HIV who doesn't have health insurance when you're applying, then that's going to be counted as a negatively weighted factor. And that's the reality. And I think the scariest part of all this, again, we're going to fight it, we're going to stop it, and we're going to, like Amanda said, we're going to, you know, act up, write back, stop AIDS, and stop public charge. And we're going, but, you know, if it does go into effect, there's so much discretion from these these consular officials are going to make determinations based on, weighing all these factors, and we have no idea how it'll come out. And so there's a lot of, you know, unclarity about how things are going to work out in the future. But right now the focus is stopping it so we don't have to worry about it.
There are also questions about would this affect DACA recipients on Medicaid if and when they might adjust their immigration status?
So to reiterate, the public charge assessment is made when somebody is seeking to adjust their status to legal permanent residency. So if that is the status that a DACA recipient is seeking, then yes.
That's only if they use the benefits. So if a person is in one of the states where if you have DACA, you're eligible for Medicaid, that will only affect you if you use Medicaid after the rule is finalized and after the implementation period. So you'll have plenty of time to make your decision about whether or not to disenroll. Again, at earliest February. So people, if you're a person who has DACA, no need to disenroll right now. Sit tight, and we'll let you know.
Okay, great. Just a couple more questions. So for the concern about leaving the U.S. for a trip outside the country, would that only be a concern for individuals who are not lawful permanent residents? Or
so actually, under certain circumstances, if you're a person with a green card who is an LPR, there are certain circumstances that are somewhat narrow. If you have any criminal sort of background in the United States, or if you leave for an extended period of time, you may have these concerns. So if you're a green card holder and you're planning to be gone for the country for a long period of time, really, or, you know, if you have any kind of criminal record issues, it actually is now important for folks to, you know, consult with an immigration attorney. It's a very narrow group of people, but, you know, if you're going to be gone for months or, you know, years, you have to check in ahead of time.
Okay. I know we're about at time, but we do have a couple more questions. Are the presenters okay with staying on like 2 or 3 more minutes? So there are a couple of questions about how trans folks could be impacted, trans immigrants who may be relying on public benefits for various kinds of healthcare, including surgeries, but not limited to. Do you have any guidance on that?
Priscilla, you want to take this one? I've been doing a lot of chatting.
Go for it, Jackie.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, this is just like anything else, right? It depends on how they're going to treat this. Are they going to treat sort of being trans as a condition that's likely to make you become a public charge because you're getting surgery? You know, we don't know, right? You know, if it's something that costs money and it's the government paying for it, you know, that potentially could be part of the totality of circumstances test. And obviously it's outrageous and discriminatory and transphobic. But yeah, it's just, I mean, the fact that you might take into consideration, we don't know how it's going to play out, but if they're going to just treat sort of anyone who needs any government funded programs as a negative factor, then and specific government programs like Medicaid, but Medicaid is paying for someone's transition, then yeah, I mean, there's no, under the way it's currently written, there's no clear exclusion for which procedures count or not.
Okay, great. And I think there's only one question we haven't answered yet. Stephanie's question, I'm not sure if I'm totally understanding it. Can you clarify if individuals who would be targeted by this rule have current access to Medicaid? I think there's some confusion about Medicaid eligibility in those seeking green cards. I think maybe you addressed this a little bit, but if you could just restate the response. So folks with green cards have a waiting period, right? Anyway, for Medicaid, is that correct?
So somebody who this is Priscilla, somebody who has newly obtained a green card status is subject to a 5-year waiting period, generally for Medicaid. And I think, I'm not exactly sure I understand the question either, but just to underscore kind of what's current policy and what Jackie and Amanda have been emphasizing as well is, right now what we have on the table is a proposal, and an unofficial one at that. So we have an indication that Medicaid will be considered as will be subject to a public charge consideration in the future if somebody uses it for a certain period of time, and when they are seeking to adjust their status or seeking to enter the U.S. So somebody who's currently on Medicaid. I mean, the categories for immigrants to receive Medicaid are fairly limited already. And so, but certainly I think the chilling effect, as others have underscored about, just ongoing confusion about Medicaid eligibility, and all of those rules relating to Medicaid enrollment, will certainly just be exacerbated under this new proposal. You've heard a few of us reference 1996 which was the last time there were federal changes and new restrictions on Medicaid eligibility. And I believe there was an MPI study that showed a 20 or 60% disenrollment just based on that confusion. So that's sort of, I think, a standard we can anticipate that might come out of this proposal as well.
I think the fact that it is just a proposal today, Wednesday, October the 3rd, and the effect that it's already having across the country is just confirms that they've succeeded in their overall goal of causing worry, fear, and total disruption. They're doing a pretty good job with that. But I'd just like to end with reminding folks that the benefits themselves are going nowhere. People who have been eligible for these benefits can still have these benefits as long as they're eligible for benefits. The eligibility of the benefit has not changed. You want the benefit, it's yours. What will change is that because you're on that benefit, you won't be able to adjust to a green card status in this country, but you will still be able to receive your health care and other benefit services. I think I feel like in our conversations with folks, that's getting lost a little too. People think they're just going to be cut off completely, but no, the benefits will continue. What changes is your immigrations, your ability to change your immigration.
But not necessarily, right? So it's the totality of circumstances test. So it's not like, okay, you have to decide, right? So I want people to also know that if they do decide to use the benefit, which we hope they will, that an immigration attorney can paper up their case and can, say that this is outweighed by other factors. So it's not like automatically I got Medicaid and therefore I'm going to be a public charge. It's a holistic determination. So just to be clear.
Okay, great. Do we have any other closing comments from our panelists?
Act up, right back. Submit a public comment. We need you.
Yes. Yes.
And don't do anything. I mean, every everyone's case is very different. There's no, you can't give any blanket statement like people from this country or people with HIV or people whose mother is sponsoring them. No, each person is individually different, and to get a clear understanding and correct information about your case, you must speak with a licensed attorney, preferably an immigration attorney, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so
And
much.
if I can also add to the comments, and I'll send this to folks, but we have a document that we put together about building a strong administrative record with some concrete tips based on our experience with the harmful Medicaid waivers that are imposing work requirements on Medicaid, for example. There's a very similar strategy, I think, with what the campaign is organizing here. So, you know, it sounds really wonky. You know, a lot of people have never even heard of administrative comments, but it really matters in the long term. And you are an expert. You are your own expert. So don't shy away from submitting something about your story or what's happening in your community.
And details aside, this is an attack on folks who are low income, folks who have medical conditions or are disabled. And that's all you need. You know, that's sort of the point of this proposal, right? And so if you feel that that's wrong, you can speak out against that.
Great, thank you so much. So I want to just encourage everyone again, go to protectingimmigrantfamilies.org, sign up to get on their mailing list. Also, if you sign up at pwn-usa.org, that's the Positive Women's Network website, we will make sure that you hear, you know, as soon as all of this stuff is ready to roll. And we will also be working with, along with Amanda, to help coordinate, you know, gathering comments from the HIV community and supporting folks in developing those comments. And I just want to really thank our presenters again for their thoughtful and in-depth presentations and willingness to answer these kind of detailed questions. This is, this draft rule is deliberately very complicated. It's this totality of circumstances test. There are 6 positive factors and 6 negative factors that can all be sort of considered, and it's deliberately kind of opaque. So don't be alarmed by that. This is part of their strategy. And, but we are absolutely going to fight this, and we are going to do it together. And the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition and campaign is one of the best organized I've ever seen. So kudos to you all. And thank you again. Thank you everybody for showing up. We will have this recording and the slide deck available on our website by tomorrow. And we'll email that to all the participants as well. Thank you. Have a great rest.